Perched alone on Whisper Creek Mountain, a decrepit cabin stood silent, its weathered walls keeping secrets buried for decades. 7-year-old Tommy Miller spent his last $5, birthday money from his late grandmother, on what locals called the ghost house at the county's abandoned property auction. With nowhere else to go after his parents' accident, Tommy and his loyal border collie, Max, moved into the only home they could afford. On their first stormy night, as thunder rattled the cabin's foundation, Max began frantically pawing at a loose floorboard beneath the stone fireplace, whining with desperate urgency. By flashlight, Tommy discovered a small iron box covered in strange symbols with words etched into its surface. "Keep sealed until blood returns to blood." What dark secret has Max uncovered in their mountain refuge? What terrible truth lies waiting in that mysterious box? And why does this innocent boy feel an eerie connection to the darkness that's been trapped for generations? The late summer wind whispered through the broken window panes of the old mountain cabin as Tommy Miller unrolled his sleeping bag onto the dusty wooden floor, his thin fingers trembling not from the chill but from the overwhelming silence of his new reality. His border collie Max circled 3 times before settling at the foot of the makeshift bed, warm amber eyes never leaving the small boy's face, as though understanding the weight of grief that bent his narrow shoulders. Just 3 weeks had passed since the car accident that took his parents, their sedan crumpled beyond recognition on the highway's sharp curve, and only 5 days since his grandmother, his last living relative, had succumbed to the heart condition she'd battled for years, leaving behind nothing but memories, a few worn photographs, and the $5 bill she'd pressed into his palm on his last birthday. The social worker, Miss Patterson, had reluctantly arranged for Tommy to attend the county auction, her face pinched with worry as she explained that without relatives willing to take him in, the foster system awaited unless, by some miracle, he could find another solution. When the auctioneer had called out the forgotten mountain property, his voice dropping to a hush as he mentioned its reputation for strange noises and abandoned status, not a single hand had raised except Tommy's small one, clutching his $5 like a talisman against the darkness of orphanhood. The locals had shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances loaded with unspoken warnings, yet no one had outbid the solemn child with eyes too old for his 7 years. Mrs. Whitaker from the neighboring farm had promised to check in daily, bringing food and necessities, buying Tommy precious time before the authorities could reconsider this unusual arrangement. The cabin itself seemed to breathe around them, its weathered logs and sagging roof, a shelter that asked nothing of its new occupant except acceptance of its flaws, something Tommy understood all too well. As night fell, bringing with it the first thunderstorm of autumn, rain lashed against the windows like desperate fingers while lightning transformed the single room into a tableau of harsh shadows and blinding light. It was during one such flash that Max suddenly stiffened, ears forward, before rushing to the stone fireplace that dominated the north wall. His paws scrabbled urgently at the floorboards, nails catching on a seam Tommy hadn't noticed before. "What is it, boy?" Tommy whispered, his voice almost lost beneath the thunder as he knelt beside his dog, the flashlight from his backpack casting a weak yellow glow on the worn wood. The loose board lifted easily under his tentative touch, revealing a small cavity carved into the earth below and, nestled within it like a secret heart, an iron box covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift in the unsteady light. With hands that trembled anew, Tommy lifted the cold metal container, feeling its surprising weight and the raised inscription that crossed its sealed lid. "Keep sealed until blood returns to blood." A chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the broken window crept up Tommy's spine as he carefully returned the box to its hiding place, covering it once more with the floorboard. Something in the cabin seemed to settle then, as though satisfied by his decision not to force the lock, to respect the warning that somehow felt meant specifically for him, a message waiting through decades of dust and silence for the return of a Miller to this forgotten mountain home. Morning light filtered through the pines as Tommy made his way down the narrow mountain path toward the small town of Whisper Creek, the mysterious iron box wrapped carefully in his faded blue sweater and tucked into his backpack. Max trotted faithfully at his side, occasionally glancing back at the bundle as though concerned by its presence outside the cabin. Tommy had waited 3 days since finding the strange container, curiosity finally overcoming his initial trepidation, as questions about the symbols and cryptic warning consumed his thoughts during the quiet mountain nights. The town consisted of little more than a single main street with weathered storefronts that had seen better days, their paint peeling under decades of harsh mountain seasons. Jenkins' General Store stood at the far end, its hand-painted signs swinging slightly in the autumn breeze, windows cluttered with a hodgepodge of essential supplies and curious oddities that had always fascinated Tommy on the rare occasions his grandmother had brought him here. A small brass bell announced their entrance, the sound echoing in the quiet shop that smelled of coffee, leather, and the peculiar mustiness of items long undisturbed. Old Mr. Jenkins looked up from his newspaper, wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the end of his nose, his weathered face crinkling into a smile that quickly faltered when he recognized the Miller boy, who everyone knew had been orphaned. "Well now, young Tommy, what brings you all the way down from that cabin of yours?" he asked, his voice gentle as he noted the absence of any adult accompanying the child. Tommy approached the worn wooden counter, carefully extracting the wrapped box and setting it on the surface between them. "I found this under the floorboard, sir, and thought maybe you might know what it is," Tommy explained, his small voice earnest as he unwrapped his grandmother's sweater to reveal the iron container with its strange markings. The change in Mr. Jenkins was immediate and alarming, his ruddy complexion draining to ashen as he took an involuntary step back, gnarled hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, eyes fixed on the symbols as though they might slither off the metal and bite him. "You found this at the Miller cabin, under the floor?" Tommy nodded, suddenly uncertain, watching as the old man hurriedly flipped the open sign to closed and locked the front door. "Those markings, Mr. Jenkins said, voice lowered as though afraid of being overheard in the empty store. "They're warnings, boy. Old mountain warnings about the treasure that brought nothing but sorrow to these hills." He leaned closer, the scent of tobacco and peppermint on his breath. 50 years ago, men came hunting something valuable hidden in these mountains, something your great-grandfather discovered. Strange things happened to anyone who went looking. Lights in the forest where no lights should be, voices calling from empty rooms, and worst of all, folks who got too close just vanished without a trace. Mr. Jenkins ran a trembling finger above the inscription without touching the metal. 3 different families tried living in that cabin after your great-grandfather disappeared, and not one stayed more than a month, driven out by nightmares and sounds of digging beneath the floor at night. His rheumy eyes met Tommy's, filled with genuine concern. "Take this back where you found it, son. Whatever's inside wants a Miller to find it. That much is clear from the inscription, but some secrets are meant to stay buried for the safety of all." Tommy swallowed hard, rewrapping the box with hands that weren't quite steady anymore, the weight of history and warning settling over him like the mountain fog as he wondered what connection his family had to whatever lurked inside the mysterious container. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled Tommy from his thoughts as he sat on the cabin's crooked front steps, the iron box safely returned to its hiding place beneath the floorboard. Max, who had been dozing in a patch of autumn sunlight, immediately stiffened, hackles rising along his spine as a sleek black car unlike any Tommy had ever seen wound its way up the overgrown drive. Dust swirled around gleaming paint as the vehicle came to a precise stop, its engine purring softly before falling silent. The man who emerged moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the rugged terrain. Not a single dark hair out of place as he surveyed the dilapidated cabin with barely concealed disdain. "Hello there, young man," he called, his voice smooth as creek stones, a practiced smile appearing that never quite reached his cold gray eyes. "My name is Richard Blackwell, representing Mountain Valley Resources. And you must be Thomas Miller." Tommy remained seated, one hand instinctively moving to rest on Max's tense shoulders as the border collie emitted a low, continuous growl. Something about the way Mr. Blackwell said his name made Tommy's stomach tighten, as though the man had been discussing him long before this visit. "Just Tommy," he corrected quietly, watching as the stranger approached, leather shoes entirely wrong for the rocky path, an expensive-looking briefcase gripped in one manicured hand. "This is quite the interesting property you've acquired," Blackwell continued, glancing around at the surrounding forest as though assessing its value rather than appreciating its beauty. "Mountain Valley Resources has had an interest in this particular parcel of land for some time now, for a potential expansion of our operations." He stopped a few feet from the steps, perhaps wary of the increasingly agitated dog. "I've been authorized to offer you $20,000 for this cabin and the surrounding 5 acres. An extremely generous amount considering its condition." The number hung in the air between them, more money than Tommy had ever imagined possessing. yet something in Mr. Starr Blackwell's eager expression, the slight forward tilt of his body, suggested that whatever lay beneath this mountain was worth far more than his offer. Tommy thought of Mr. Jenkins' warnings, of the mysterious box, and of the strange sense of rightness he'd felt since arriving here despite the cabin's many flaws. "It's not for sale, sir," Tommy replied, his young voice steady with a certainty that clearly surprised the corporate representative. Blackwell's smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something harder and colder beneath the polished exterior. "Perhaps you should discuss this with your guardian before making such decisions. This is a very adult matter after all." He placed a business card on the bottom step, pristine white against weathered wood. "I'll return in a few days. I'm confident we can reach an agreement that benefits everyone involved." Without waiting for a response, he returned to his car, the gentle closing of its door somehow more threatening than if he had slammed it in frustration. As the black vehicle disappeared down the winding path, Tommy noticed Max had abandoned his defensive posture and was now investigating the tire tracks left in the soft earth, sniffing intently before looking back at the cabin with an almost human expression of concern. Tommy followed his dog's gaze to the stone chimney, where for just a moment he thought he saw a flicker of movement in the upper window, though the cabin had no second floor that he had discovered. Later, as the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep purple, Tommy found himself unable to shake the feeling that Richard Blackwell had known exactly what lay hidden beneath the cabin floor and would return with far more than a generous offer and practiced smile. Darkness had settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket, moonlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls as Tommy drifted into an uneasy sleep, the day's encounter with Mr. Blackwell still troubling his thoughts. The dream came swiftly, not in the fragmented way of normal dreams, but with a clarity that felt more like memory than imagination. Colors vibrant and sounds crystal clear. A young boy wearing clothes from another time, suspenders over a rough cotton shirt, knelt beside the very same stone fireplace that dominated Tommy's cabin. Though the hearth looked newer, the surrounding room more alive with simple furniture and the warm glow of oil lamps, Tommy instantly recognized it as the same place where he now slept. The boy worked with frantic determination, his small hands calloused beyond his years as he pried up the floorboard, his movements suggesting both urgency and fear. "They mustn't find it," the boy whispered to himself, his voice trembling as he placed something wrapped in oilcloth into the hollow space beneath the floor. "Father said it proves what they've done, what they're still doing to the water and the people here." Moonlight from a nearby window illuminated the boy's face as he glanced nervously toward the cabin door, and Tommy felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it seemed to reverberate through the dream itself. The boy could have been his own reflection, the same cowlick that refused to lie flat, the same constellation of freckles across the bridge of his nose, the same determined set to his jaw that Tommy's grandmother had always claimed was the Miller stubbornness showing through. Only the eyes were different, a deep forest green instead of Tommy's blue, yet holding the same expression of a child forced by circumstances to shoulder adult burdens. Before the dream could reveal what precious item the boy had hidden, a sound of approaching horses drove him to quickly replace the floorboard and scatter dust over its seams. As he straightened, the boy whispered words that seemed directed not at the empty room, but across time itself. "When blood returns to blood, the truth will finally be known." Tommy woke with a violent start, sweat dampening his pajamas despite the autumn chill that permeated the cabin. The first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor. Max sat perfectly still beside the stone fireplace, his intelligent eyes fixed on the loose floorboard, ears pricked forward as though listening for something beyond human perception. The border collie didn't acknowledge Tommy's waking, maintaining his silent vigil over the hidden box with an intensity that sent shivers down the boy's spine. Tommy pushed himself up from his sleeping bag, the vivid images from the dream still burning in his mind as he moved to join Max by the fireplace. "He looked just like me," Tommy whispered, reaching out to stroke Max's soft fur, seeking comfort in the familiar texture. "That boy from long ago, he was a Miller too, wasn't he?" The dog finally turned to meet his gaze, dark eyes seeming to hold wisdom far beyond animal understanding. Tommy glanced back at the floorboard, remembering the inscription on the iron box, "Keep sealed until blood returns to blood." A certainty began to form in his young mind. as solid and undeniable as the mountain itself. This cabin wasn't just some random property he'd acquired by strange circumstance. His $5 hadn't purchased a simple shelter but had somehow brought him home, to a place where his family's past lay buried, waiting for his return. Whatever secret the box contained had been hidden by his own blood, perhaps by a great-grandfather or distant uncle whose face he now wore like an inheritance more tangible than the cabin itself. The walk to Whisper Creek Elementary felt longer than usual as Tommy's mind churned with questions about his dream and the strange box hidden beneath his cabin floor. The school building stood as a lone brick sentinel against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains, its red facade a stark contrast to the endless green and brown of the surrounding wilderness. Tommy had been attending classes for only a week since moving to the cabin, just long enough for the whispers about the orphan boy who lives alone to follow him through the hallways like persistent shadows. During lunch period, while other children laughed and played in the autumn sunshine, Tommy slipped quietly into the small library tucked at the far end of the building, its hushed atmosphere a welcome respite from curious stares and pitying glances. The room smelled of old paper and furniture polish, shelves stretching from floor to ceiling in neat rows that seemed to hold endless possibilities for answers. Miss Patterson, the librarian whose silver-streaked bun and wire-rimmed glasses gave her the appearance of a wise owl, looked up from her desk with mild surprise as Tommy approached. "I need to learn about the history of my cabin," he explained, his young voice earnest yet hesitant, and about the Millers who might have lived there before. Something flickered across Miss Patterson's face, a momentary tightening around her eyes that suggested recognition before her features softened into a gentle smile. "Local history is in the back corner, dear," she said, rising from her chair with surprising agility for her age. "But I think I know exactly what might help you." She led him through the maze of shelves to a locked cabinet that housed fragile materials, her keys jingling softly as she selected an ancient-looking brass one. Inside were bound volumes of the Whisper Creek Chronicle, dating back nearly a century, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. Miss Patterson carefully extracted a particular volume marked 1972 to 1974, setting it on a nearby table with reverent hands. "Your name caught my attention when you enrolled," she confided, voice lowered though they were alone in the library. "Miller isn't common in these parts anymore, but 50 years ago, that name was at the center of quite a controversy." Tommy leaned forward as she gently turned the delicate pages, stopping at a headline that made his heart beat faster. "Local miner challenges Mountain Valley Corporation over water contamination claims." Beneath the bold type was a grainy photograph of a man standing defiantly in front of a familiar cabin, his stance proud despite the worry evident in his eyes. Though the image was faded, Tommy instantly recognized the same features he saw in his mirror each morning, the same features he'd seen on the boy in his dream. "That's Joseph Miller," Miss Patterson explained, her finger hovering above the photo without touching the fragile newsprint. "He worked for the mining company until he discovered something that troubled him deeply. He claimed they were poisoning the groundwater, but before his evidence could be properly examined, he disappeared under mysterious circumstances." She turned to more articles documenting the dispute. The subsequent investigation that found insufficient evidence of wrongdoing, and the eventual acquisition of several properties around the mountain by Mountain Valley Resources, except for the Miller cabin, which remained unclaimed due to legal complications. "Your family has deeper roots in this mountain than most realize," Miss Patterson said, studying Tommy's face with newfound interest. "If you want to learn more, you should visit the County Historical Society in Riversend. They keep records that never made it into the newspapers, documents too controversial for public consumption in those days." Tommy nodded solemnly, eyes still fixed on the image of his ancestor. Understanding blooming inside him like a flower turning toward light, the mysterious box and its warning taking on new and urgent meaning as the pieces of his family's past began to align with alarming clarity. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cabin's weathered porch as a blue pickup truck rumbled up the narrow dirt road. Tommy and Max watched from the doorway as an elderly woman emerged, silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, her lined face tanned from decades under the mountain sun, arms laden with paper grocery bags. "So it's true then," she called out, voice strong despite her years as she assessed the small boy standing in the doorway. A Miller child back in the old place, and all on his own. She approached with purpose, extending a work-roughened hand. "Martha Whitaker, from the farm down in the valley." I promised the social services lady I'd check on you, though I scarcely believed her when she said they'd let a child your age stay up here alone." Tommy shook her hand solemnly, feeling an immediate warmth in her firm grip that reminded him of his grandmother. "I knew your grandmother, Eleanor, since we were schoolgirls together," Martha continued, her keen blue eyes taking in Tommy's thin frame with concern. "Stubborn as a mountain mule, that woman. Always said she'd return to this place someday." Martha bustled past him into the cabin, setting down her bags and unpacking provisions: fresh bread, jars of home-canned vegetables, a container of stew, and dog food for Max, who watched with cautious optimism. "Eleanor wrote to me when your parents died," Martha said more softly. "Asked if I'd keep an eye on this place, said she had a feeling you might find your way here someday." She looked around the single room with knowing eyes. "This mountain holds secrets, child, secrets your family has guarded for generations." Tommy helped arrange the supplies, drawn to this woman who spoke of his grandmother with such familiar affection. "I can bring fresh milk and eggs every few days, teach you to tend a proper vegetable patch come spring," Martha offered, settling into the cabin's chair. "The social worker says they'll let you stay as long as you're properly looked after, and I've promised I'll see to it." She gazed out the window at the forested slope, expression growing distant. "When I was about your age, your great-grandfather Joseph used to tell us children's stories about the spirit of the mountain, how it chose certain people to protect its heart." Her voice took on a rhythmic quality. "He said the mountain water ran pure as truth until the mining company came with their machines that bit into the earth like hungry beasts. That's when folks started getting sick, when fish began to float belly up in the creek." Martha's eyes returned to Tommy, sharp with purpose. "Joseph Miller stood against them, with nothing but evidence they wanted to destroy. The day before he was to present his findings to officials, he vanished, along with whatever proof he'd gathered." She leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But your grandmother always believed he found a way to preserve the truth, that he hid it somewhere only a Miller could find." Tommy's hand instinctively moved toward the loose floorboard, a movement Martha's observant eyes didn't miss. "I'll be back tomorrow with more supplies," she said, rising with a groan of aging joints. "And perhaps you'll have something to share with me by then, young Miller." The sleek black car returned 3 days later, its engine purring softly as it came to a stop in front of the cabin where Tommy and Max had been repairing a loose step on the porch. Richard Blackwell emerged looking even more polished than before, his smile thin and predatory as he approached with a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. "Good morning, young Mr. Miller," he called with false cheerfulness that made Tommy's stomach tighten. "I trust you've had time to reconsider our generous offer." When Tommy remained silent, the businessman's expression hardened slightly around the edges. "I see. Well, I'm afraid there's a more pressing matter we need to discuss." He extracted several official-looking documents from his portfolio, holding them up so the embossed legal seals caught the morning light. "It appears there's a significant issue with your claim to this property. According to county records, minors cannot legally own real estate without a proper trust or guardianship arrangement." His voice took on a tone of manufactured concern. "I've taken the liberty of filing a petition with the court to review your situation. It would be a shame if you were removed from this property due to such technical complications." Tommy felt a cold fear spreading through him, but remembered Martha's reassurances about the social worker's approval of his living arrangement. "Mrs. Whitaker is looking after me," he said, his young voice steadier than he felt. "And the social services lady said it was okay for now." Blackwell's smile never reached his eyes. "A neighbor stopping by occasionally hardly constitutes proper guardianship in the eyes of the law. Mountain Valley Resources, however, would be willing to withdraw our petition if you agreed to our purchase offer. We could even arrange a nice apartment in town for you, something much more comfortable than this dilapidated structure." Max moved closer to Tommy, a low growl rumbling in his throat as he positioned himself between the boy and Blackwell. The corporate representative took a cautious step back, his confidence faltering slightly in the face of the dog's obvious displeasure. "Think it over, Tommy," Blackwell said, returning the papers to his portfolio. "I'll give you one more week before our legal department proceeds. This can be easy, or it can be very difficult. The choice is yours." He placed another business card on the porch railing before retreating to his vehicle, the tires spinning slightly in the dirt as he departed with more haste than dignity. Tommy remained on the porch long after the dust had settled, his mind racing with fears of being forced from the only place that had felt like home since his parents died. It was only when Max suddenly stiffened beside him, ears forward and alert, that Tommy noticed movement at the tree line approximately 200 yards from the cabin. 3 men in dark suits stood partially concealed by the forest's edge, one holding what appeared to be surveying equipment while another consulted a map, pointing occasionally toward different areas of the property. The third man raised what Tommy initially thought was binoculars but then recognized with a chill as a camera with a long lens, pointed directly at the cabin. Tommy quickly retreated inside, heart pounding as he peeked through the window to see the men methodically working their way around the perimeter of his property, stopping occasionally to take measurements or photographs. That night, Max refused to settle in his usual sleeping spot, instead positioning himself directly in front of the door, his body tense and alert even in slumber. When Tommy awoke the following morning, he found the border collie in exactly the same vigilant posture, amber eyes tracking every movement outside the cabin windows, his protective instincts seemingly heightened by some perception of danger that lurked beyond Tommy's understanding, but connected somehow to the mysterious box, still hidden safely beneath the floorboards. The County Historical Society occupied the upper floor of Riversend's old courthouse, a stately brick building with tall windows that had witnessed generations of the region's history unfold beneath its watchful gaze. Martha drove Tommy there the following Saturday in her ancient pickup, the cab filled with the scent of coffee from her thermos and the comforting smell of wool from her cardigan as she recounted her own childhood memories of the mountain. "Your grandmother and I used to pick blackberries on that hillside behind your cabin," she told him, her weathered hands confident on the steering wheel as they wound through mountain roads painted with autumn's fiery palette. The Historical Society's archivist, a thin man named Mr. Abernathy with spectacles that magnified his already owlish eyes, initially seemed reluctant to help until Martha mentioned the Miller name, which transformed his hesitation into a curious eagerness. "The Miller documents are in a special collection," he informed them, leading the way through narrow aisles created by towering filing cabinets and shelves laden with leather-bound records that smelled of dust and preservation chemicals. Not many people ask to see them these days. The special collection turned out to be a small, locked room at the rear of the archive, containing several boxes of materials that Mr. Skorda Abernathy arranged carefully on a wooden table scaled for adult researchers, leaving Tommy standing on tiptoe to see properly. Martha helped him sort through property deeds, mining maps, and correspondence, explaining the complex documents in terms the 7-year-old could understand. "Here," she said, voice softening as she extracted a brittle certificate. "This proves the land has been in your family since 1887, when your great-great-grandfather first homesteaded it." Tommy's fingers hovered above the elegant script that spelled out Miller, an ancestor's name written long before his birth yet, connected to him through invisible threads of family and fate. Deeper in the box, they discovered a slim file labeled Disappearance Investigation 1973, containing police reports describing Joseph Miller's last known movements, witness statements from neighbors who reported unusual vehicles near the cabin the night before he vanished, and a frustrated letter from the county sheriff to Joseph's wife, expressing regret that the investigation had reached a dead end due to lack of cooperation from certain parties. Most compelling was a manila envelope, tucked at the bottom of the file, containing photographs from Joseph's home. With trembling hands, Martha extracted a faded color photograph, showing a man standing proudly before the cabin, his resemblance to Tommy so striking it caused Mr. Abernathy to glance between the image and the boy several times with undisguised amazement. In Joseph Miller's hands, held as carefully as one might carry a sacred relic, was an iron box identical to the one hidden beneath Tommy's floorboard, its symbols clearly visible despite the photograph's age. He knew they were coming for him, Martha whispered, her finger tracing the determined set of Joseph's jaw. This picture was taken the day before he disappeared. Tommy stared at the image of his great-grandfather, understanding flowing between them across the decades, a silent message passing from those eyes so like his own. The box hadn't simply been hidden in the cabin by chance. It had been deliberately concealed, protected, preserved for future discovery by someone who shared the same blood, the same name, perhaps even the same destiny. The first incident occurred the morning after their visit to the Historical Society, when Tommy woke to find his backpack had moved from the hook by the door to sit perfectly centered beneath the cabin's single window, its zipper open as though someone had been searching inside. He might have dismissed it as forgetfulness had he not distinctly remembered hanging it up before bed, Martha's warning to keep his school books dry still fresh in his mind. 3 days later, his grandmother's photograph, normally propped against a jar on the rough wooden table, appeared on the mantel above the fireplace, positioned to face the loose floorboard that concealed the iron box. Most unsettling were the cold spots that seemed to materialize without warning, pockets of air so chilled they raised goosebumps on Tommy's arms even as autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, these frigid patches often lingering near the stone fireplace or beside the eastern wall where an old trunk stood. Max became increasingly alert to phenomena Tommy couldn't perceive, his ears swiveling toward empty corners, head tilting as though listening to whispers too faint for human hearing. Sometimes the border collie would stand suddenly, tail rigid, eyes tracking something invisible as it moved across the room, a low whine building in his throat that wasn't fear but something closer to frustration, as if he understood a message he couldn't communicate to his young master. Late one evening, as Tommy prepared for bed by the light of the oil lamp Martha had provided, shadows played across the cabin walls in ways that seemed independent of the flame's natural flicker, drawing his attention to a series of faint scratches in the aged wood that he hadn't noticed before. Curious, he moved the lamp closer, revealing dozens of marks that appeared random at first glance, but began to form patterns as he studied them more carefully. Taking a piece of paper from his school notebook, Tommy traced the scratches, connecting them like a constellation map, until the shapes emerged with unmistakable clarity, the same ancient symbols that adorned the iron box beneath the floorboard. He moved slowly around the cabin's perimeter, finding more scratches, more symbols, some freshly carved while others had darkened with decades of exposure, all seemingly positioned to create a circular pattern around the fireplace where the box lay hidden. That night, as wind whispered through pine boughs outside and moonlight painted silver patterns on the cabin floor, Tommy awoke to the distinct sensation of being watched, not with malice but with an intense, expectant awareness. The temperature around his sleeping bag had dropped dramatically, his breath forming small clouds in the midnight air. Yet he felt no fear, only a growing certainty that the cabin itself was trying to speak to him, to guide him toward understanding something of vital importance. Max lay alert beside him, eyes reflecting moonlight as they both watched a small toy soldier Tommy had found in the woods, a remnant of some previous child's play, slowly rotate in place on the table until it pointed directly at the fireplace, a miniature sentry marking the path toward revelation. Morning brought no rational explanation for the phenomena, only the lingering certainty in Tommy's mind that the cabin wasn't haunted in the traditional, frightening sense, but awakened, stirred to consciousness by the return of Miller blood to its timbers, attempting through the only means available to convey some urgent message about the box, the mountain, and the mystery that had claimed his great-grandfather's life decades before he was born. Sleep claimed Tommy earlier than usual that night, his small body exhausted from the emotional weight of discovering his family's history and the strange occurrences in the cabin. The dream seized him instantly, more vivid than the first, immersing him completely in a night decades past when rain lashed against the cabin windows and thunder shook the mountain with nature's fury. He watched through his great-grandfather's eyes, feeling Joseph Miller's racing heart and desperate determination as voices shouted outside, car doors slamming in the muddy yard. "They're here," Joseph whispered to himself, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he secured something inside what appeared to be the iron box, his calloused fingers tracing the symbols as though activating some ancient protection. The water samples, the medical records, the photographic proof, all of it preserved now. Tommy felt the weight of the box in his great-grandfather's hands, felt the fear and resolve intermingling as Joseph moved not toward the fireplace but to the opposite corner of the cabin where a large wooden trunk stood against the wall. With strength born of desperation, he shifted the heavy trunk, revealing a small section of the foundation stones that appeared slightly different from the rest. Joseph pried one loose, creating a cavity just large enough for a leather-bound journal which he placed inside with trembling hands. "They can take me, but they can't take the truth," he whispered, quickly replacing the stone and sliding the trunk back into position mere seconds before the cabin door burst open, revealing 3 men in dark suits silhouetted by a flash of lightning. Tommy saw the center man's face clearly, recognizing with a chill the same sharp features and cold eyes that characterized Richard Blackwell, this man clearly an ancestor with the same predatory demeanor. "It's over, Miller." The Blackwell look-alike snarled, rain dripping from his fedora as 2 larger men flanked him. "Where are the documents? Where's the evidence you're planning to take to the state inspector? Joseph stood straight-backed before the intruders, the iron box nowhere in sight, his voice steady despite the danger. You're too late. The truth can't be buried forever. The dream fragmented then, dissolving into chaotic images of struggle, Joseph being dragged from his home, a final desperate glance toward the corner where the journal lay hidden. Tommy woke with a strangled gasp, sweat soaked despite the cabin's chill, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. Without conscious decision, he found himself moving toward the corner where the ancient trunk still stood in exactly the same position as in his dream. Max was already there, pawing excitedly at the floor where the trunk met the wall, whining with an urgency that confirmed Tommy's instinct. Together they pushed the heavy container aside, revealing foundation stones identical to those in the dream. One stone, slightly smaller than the others, had a barely perceptible difference in its coloring, a subtle variation that would be invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Tommy's small fingers probed the edges, finding the slight indentation that allowed him to pry the stone loose, just as his great-grandfather had done decades earlier. The cavity behind it remained intact, preserved by the solid construction of the foundation, and nestled within its protected space lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but legible, the name Joseph Miller, inscribed on the first page in a confident hand. Tommy cradled the book with reverence, understanding instinctively that he held not just a record of past events, but a legacy of truth entrusted to him across time by a man whose blood ran in his veins, whose courage he would need to emulate in the days to come. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows as Tommy sat cross-legged on his sleeping bag, the leather journal open on his lap, Max curled protectively beside him as though standing guard over the precious discovery. The first entries dated from 1970, written in his great-grandfather's neat, determined handwriting, beginning as ordinary accounts of daily mining work, but gradually shifting toward observations that made Tommy's heart beat faster. Found something unusual in the North Shaft today. Read an entry from March 1971. Water seeping through a new fissure has an unnatural color, carries a chemical smell that burns the nostrils. Mentioned it to the foreman who dismissed my concerns, but I collected samples in glass jars regardless. Tommy turned pages with careful fingers, following the evolution of Joseph's suspicions as subsequent entries described illnesses among miners. Fish dying in unprecedented numbers in the local creek, and his first connection between these occurrences and the mine's new chemical extraction process. It's not gold or copper they're really after, Joseph wrote in August 1972, his handwriting becoming more urgent. The real value lies in rare minerals they've discovered deep in the mountain, elements worth fortunes to military contractors and electronics manufacturers. Their extraction method poisons everything it touches, leaching toxins into the groundwater that feeds every well, every spring, every creek in the valley. Tommy read how his great-grandfather began secretly documenting evidence, collecting water samples, photographing dead wildlife, and recording medical complaints from families throughout Whisper Creek, building a case too substantial to ignore. 3 children in the valley have developed unusual blood disorders this year alone, noted a particularly distressed entry. The company doctor dismisses each case as coincidental, but Dr. Richardson in Riversend confirmed my fears privately, saying he's never seen such a pattern in 30 years of practice. The journal chronicled veiled threats that began once Joseph voiced his concerns to mine management. A suspicious fire in his tool shed, warnings from suddenly unfriendly neighbors, his request for a safety inspection mysteriously removed from county records. Blackwell himself visited today. Read an entry from April 1973, just weeks before Joseph's disappearance. Offered to buy the cabin and land for 10 times its worth, insisted I consider my family's well-being. When I refused, his parting words chilled my bones. Some folks who push too hard against progress simply disappear from the narrative. Miller. The final entries grew increasingly paranoid yet resolute, describing Joseph's plan to present his evidence at the State Environmental Commission hearing scheduled for the 15th of May 1973. I've duplicated everything, he wrote in the last complete entry. The comprehensive documentation goes into the iron box, sealed with symbols of protection my grandfather learned from the indigenous people who first recognized this mountain's sacred nature. Should anything happen to me, the box will await another Miller's touch, blood returning to blood when the time is right. The journal's last page contained a hastily scrawled note dated May 10. The very night of Tommy's dream. They're coming. I hear their cars on the mountain road. The box is hidden. This journal goes into the foundation stone. The truth cannot die even if I do. To whoever finds this, the box contains proof of murder, not just of people, but of the mountain itself. May justice finally prevail. Tommy closed the journal with trembling hands, understanding at last the weight of inheritance that had brought him to this cabin, and the responsibility that now rested on his 7-year-old shoulders to complete what his great-grandfather had died trying to accomplish. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the mountain peaks when Martha's blue pickup rumbled up the dirt road, bringing her earlier than her usual visiting time. Tommy had been waiting on the porch steps, the journal hidden safely under a loose board beneath his sleeping bag, his mind racing with questions only an adult might help answer. Martha's face looked different today, the usual warmth in her eyes tempered by a gravity that suggested important matters at hand. "I think it's time we had a proper talk, Tommy Miller," she said without preamble as she settled beside him on the steps, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about what I know." She gazed out at the forested slope rising behind the cabin, gathering her thoughts before continuing in a lower voice. "Your grandmother Eleanor and I made a pact almost 50 years ago, the summer after your great-grandfather vanished. We promised to protect this place, to keep watch over it until a Miller returned who could finish what Joseph started." Martha turned to face Tommy directly, studying his young features with an intensity that made him sit straighter. "Eleanor married and moved away after the tragedy, too heartbroken to stay, but she made me swear to never sell my adjacent property, to keep eyes on this cabin, and to help any Miller who might someday return." She reached into her cardigan pocket, extracting a tarnished key on a leather cord. "This opens a lockbox in my farmhouse cellar containing property deeds and legal documents Eleanor prepared before her death. She suspected the mining company would try to challenge any Miller's claim to this land. So she created an ironclad trust, naming her descendants as legal inheritors regardless of age." Martha's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Mountain Valley Resources has tried to acquire this property 16 times over 5 decades, using everything from generous offers to legal intimidation to outright threats. Whatever lies beneath this ground must be immensely valuable for them to persist so relentlessly, though I don't know exactly what it is." She placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "When the social worker contacted me about a Miller boy purchasing the cabin at auction, I knew instantly that Eleanor's prediction had come true. The timing is no coincidence, child. The mining company recently filed permits for a massive new extraction project on this mountain, using techniques that would make what they did 50 years ago look harmless by comparison." Martha's eyes grew distant, remembering. "I was there the night Joseph disappeared. I was just a girl, but I saw the cars coming up the mountain road, heard the shouting. My father forbade me from interfering, said it would only bring the same fate to our family." Her voice cracked with emotion long suppressed. "I've carried that shame for half a century, child. I couldn't help Joseph then, but I can help you now. Whatever your great-grandfather hid, whatever truth he protected with his life, the time has come for it to see daylight." Martha straightened her shoulders with renewed purpose. "I don't know what's in that box you've found, but I know this. You aren't alone in this fight anymore. Eleanor made sure of that, and so will I." Miss Reynolds stood before the 5th grade class, her enthusiasm evident as she explained the family history assignment that would count for a significant portion of their social studies grade. "This is your chance to become real historians," she announced, writing the project parameters on the chalkboard with flourishes that sent dust motes dancing in the autumn sunlight streaming through the classroom windows. "Interview family members, gather photographs, and create a timeline of important events that shaped your family's journey." Tommy sat quietly at his desk near the back of the room, pencil tapping thoughtfully against his notebook as he considered the rich material he now possessed about his great-grandfather, material that seemed almost too significant for a simple school project. The classroom felt suddenly smaller when he realized this might be an opportunity to bring Joseph Miller's story into the light, to make others understand the importance of what had happened on Whisper Creek Mountain half a century ago. For 3 evenings, Tommy carefully organized his presentation, selecting passages from the journal that explained his great-grandfather's discovery without revealing the box's existence, gathering the Historical Society photographs, and creating a simple family tree that connected him to Joseph through the generations. On presentation day, Tommy stood before his classmates with quiet determination, his voice growing stronger as he described his great-grandfather as a miner who discovered dangerous pollution and tried to protect the community. He was halfway through explaining how Joseph had mysteriously disappeared when he noticed a boy in the front row showing increasing signs of distress. James, a quiet student who had joined their class only a month before, was now rigid in his seat, his face flushed with what appeared to be anger or embarrassment. Tommy faltered briefly, recognizing something familiar in James's sharp features and calculating eyes, before continuing with his great-grandfather's story. Miss Reynolds seemed deeply impressed, awarding Tommy an A and commenting on his exceptional research, while most students quickly forgot the presentation as they anticipated recess. James, however, remained seated as others filed out, his gaze fixed on Tommy with undisguised hostility. It was only when Tommy spotted Richard Blackwell's sleek black car waiting in the school parking lot later that afternoon that the connection crystallized in his mind with stunning clarity. James's features suddenly recognizable as a younger version of the corporate representative who had threatened his home. Tommy ducked behind the school building, heart racing as he watched James approach the vehicle, the boy's earlier composure completely abandoned as he gesticulated wildly while speaking to his father through the car window. Though too distant to hear everything, fragments of their conversation carried across the nearly empty schoolyard on the crisp autumn air. "The Miller kid knows." James's voice rose with adolescent indignation, followed by his father's lower, controlled response, then more clearly. He talked about evidence and pollution in front of everyone. The final exchange chilled Tommy more than the mountain winds ever could, Richard Blackwell's voice carrying just enough for the words, "accelerate our timeline," and before he discovers the rest to reach Tommy's hiding place. The black car pulled away with James inside, leaving Tommy frozen in place, understanding with crystal clarity that his school project had inadvertently revealed his investigation to the very people his great-grandfather had died trying to expose. People who now knew exactly how much danger their secrets were in from the last remaining Miller on Whisper Creek Mountain. Tommy knew something was wrong before he even reached the cabin's clearing. Max had suddenly stiffened beside him on their walk home from the bus stop, hackles raised as a low growl rumbled from the border collie's throat. The cabin door stood partially open, swinging gently in the mountain breeze, though Tommy distinctly remembered securing it with the padlock Martha had provided after the first visit from Blackwell. His steps slowed as he approached, the weight of foreboding growing heavier with each footfall on the pine needle-strewn path. The interior of the cabin looked as though a whirlwind had torn through it, his few possessions scattered across the floor. His sleeping bag slashed open with stuffing spilling onto the rough wooden planks like tufts of dirty snow. The small bookshelf lay overturned, his school texts splayed open with pages bent and torn. Most telling was the state of the hearth, where the loose floorboard had been completely removed and the hollow beneath excavated, dirt piled carelessly to one side in the intruder's frantic search for the iron box. Tommy allowed himself a small measure of relief, knowing they had found nothing. After discovering the journal, he had relocated both it and the box to a hollow space beneath a large rock near the creek, inspired by his great-grandfather's foresight in creating multiple hiding places. His momentary calm shattered when he spotted the note pinned to the wall with his own scout knife, the blade driven deep into the aged wood. The message, composed of letters cut from what appeared to be a newspaper and glued to plain white paper, delivered its warning with chilling clarity. "Stop digging into the past if you want a future." The childish part of Tommy wanted to flee, to run down the mountain and never look back, but something stronger held him in place, the same determination he had seen in Joseph's eyes in the Historical Society photograph, the same resilience that had allowed his 7-year-old body to survive the series of losses that had brought him to this moment. Martha arrived an hour later, her face draining of color as she surveyed the destruction. "This settles it," she declared, already gathering Tommy's remaining intact clothes into a pillowcase. "You're coming to stay at my farm. It's not safe here anymore." Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she worked, betraying fear she was trying to conceal behind brisk efficiency. "They wouldn't dare come to my property. Not with the sheriff being my late husband's cousin." Tommy stood in the center of the chaos. Max pressed reassuringly against his leg and slowly shook his head. "I can't leave, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his young voice steady despite the fear still coiled in his stomach. "This is where I'm supposed to be. This is where the answers are." Martha stopped her hurried packing, studying the small boy with a mixture of exasperation and growing respect. "Your grandmother had that same look," she finally said with a resigned sigh. "When Eleanor Miller set her mind to something, heaven and earth couldn't move her. She crossed the room to stand before Tommy, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "At least let me stay here with you tonight while we clean up this mess, and tomorrow we'll fetch my husband's old shotgun from the farm, just to have it nearby." Tommy nodded his agreement to this compromise, his eyes drawn again to the threatening note as Martha began setting the cabin to rights. Understanding with a clarity beyond his years that the intrusion had only confirmed what his great-grandfather had discovered decades ago, a truth powerful enough to drive desperate men to criminal acts, a secret that might still cost a Miller his life. The Whisper Creek Community Center buzzed with tension as residents filed into the wood-paneled meeting hall, their conversations creating a nervous hum that reflected the divisive nature of the evening's topic. Posters displayed around the room showed architectural renderings of Mountain Valley Resources' proposed expansion, glossy images of modern facilities promising jobs and prosperity juxtaposed against maps highlighting the substantial land acquisition required, including the small patch of mountain marked clearly as Miller property. Tommy sat beside Martha in the back row, feeling conspicuous and small among the adults who alternately regarded him with curiosity, sympathy, or in some cases, poorly disguised hostility. Richard Blackwell commanded the room from the podium, his presentation slick and persuasive as he detailed the economic benefits his company would bring to the struggling region, carefully avoiding specific mentions of environmental impact while emphasizing modern safety protocols and responsible stewardship. His gaze occasionally flicked toward Tommy with something resembling triumph, as though the outcome were already decided, the Miller resistance merely a minor inconvenience soon to be overcome. When the floor opened for community comments, Blackwell's confident smile faltered as Edwin Jenkins, the elderly shopkeeper who had first warned Tommy about the box, rose shakily to his feet. "My father worked 32 years in that mine," Jenkins began, his voice quavering but determined. "Died of what the company called unrelated pulmonary complications, even as fish washed up dead in our creek, and children developed mysterious rashes from swimming in the water Joseph Miller tried to warn us about." Murmurs rippled through the audience as others began to nod, memories long suppressed now finding voice. Hattie Simmons, who ran the post office, stood next, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. "My sister lost 2 babies to miscarriage the year after the North Shaft was expanded. 4 other women in the valley suffered the same fate that season, all drawing water from wells on the same aquifer Joseph Miller identified as contaminated." The testimonies continued, a litany of illnesses, deaths, and environmental degradation spanning 5 decades, countered by younger residents arguing for jobs and economic opportunity in a region plagued by poverty since the mine's scaling back of operations. The meeting devolved into heated exchanges between neighbors, friends finding themselves on opposite sides of a divide that had silently existed beneath the community's surface for generations. Mayor Wilson struggled to maintain order, his gavel pounding ineffectually as accusations flew across the room. Throughout the chaos, Tommy noticed several of the older residents making their way toward him and Martha, forming a protective circle around the youngest Miller, as though their collective presence could shield him from the corporate machinations that had claimed his great-grandfather. "We should have stood with Joseph back then," whispered a gray-haired man Tommy didn't recognize, regret etching deep lines around his eyes. Fear kept us silent while he fought alone, but not this time. Not with the last Miller child. The meeting ended without resolution, the community too fractured to reach consensus, but as Tommy walked out into the cool night air, he felt something shift in the mountain town's atmosphere. The silent burden carried by those who remembered Joseph Miller's fight had found expression at last, and the small boy who had arrived as a rootless orphan now found himself at the center of a battle that had waited half a century for its final reckoning. The day after the town meeting, Tommy sat cross-legged on the cabin floor, Joseph's journal open before him as afternoon light cast long shadows through the windows, Max dozing nearby after their morning patrol of the property perimeter. Martha had helped restore order to the ransacked cabin, but Tommy found himself drawn repeatedly to the journal, carefully rereading entries he'd previously skimmed in his initial excitement, looking for any clues his great-grandfather might have left about the box's contents or how to access them. A passage from early 1973 caught his attention, Joseph's handwriting more hurried than usual as he described preparing for the possibility of confrontation. "Finished the false bottom in the desk drawer today, a clever bit of carpentry if I do say so. Unless someone knows to press both side panels simultaneously while lifting, the compartment remains invisible. The perfect place for what I've created to unlock the truth when needed. Tommy's heart quickened as he raised his eyes to the scarred oak desk standing against the western wall. A hulking piece of furniture too heavy for the intruders to have moved during their search, its 3 drawers already emptied and carelessly rifled through. Moving to the desk with renewed purpose, Tommy pulled open the largest bottom drawer that had once held his great-grandfather's papers, now containing only dust and splinters from the rough handling. His small fingers explored the drawer's construction, pressing experimentally against the side panels until he felt a slight give on both sides simultaneously. Holding the pressure steady, he lifted upward as Joseph had described, feeling a subtle click as the false bottom released, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment beneath. Nestled in this secret space lay a single object, a tarnished brass key unlike any Tommy had seen before, its shaft inscribed with minute engravings, while its handle formed an intricate pattern of the very same symbols that adorned the iron box. Tommy lifted it with reverent care, the metal cool against his skin, yet somehow emanating a sense of significance that seemed to vibrate through his fingers, a physical connection to the great-grandfather whose blood ran in his veins, whose courage he was now called to emulate. The afternoon sun caught the brass, highlighting details that made Tommy catch his breath. Small nodules along the shaft, positioned precisely to align with the corresponding indentations he had noticed around the box's keyhole. A mechanism far more complex than an ordinary lock, designed specifically to prevent anyone without this exact key from accessing the contents. Max had awakened and now watched Tommy with alert interest, as though the border collie sensed the significance of the discovery that connected past to present, the missing piece that might finally reveal what Joseph Miller had given his life to protect. With trembling hands, Tommy returned the journal to its hiding place beneath the loose floorboard, but the key he slipped into his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of his inheritance as he moved through the remainder of the day, completing chores Martha had assigned with half his attention, while the other half remained fixed on the creekside rock, where the iron box lay hidden, waiting for the moment when he could retrieve it and, with the newly discovered key, finally unlock the truth his family had guarded for half a century. The late afternoon shadows had begun to stretch across the cabin's small clearing when the now familiar sound of Blackwell's sleek black car announced his unwelcome arrival, the vehicle's expensive tires crunching on the gravel with deliberate slowness, as though savoring the moment. Tommy stood on the porch with Max at his side, the dog's low growl a continuous warning, as Blackwell emerged, this time accompanied by a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses carrying a leather briefcase, his expression suggesting he found the entire situation distasteful, but financially necessary. "Thomas Miller," Blackwell called with artificial cheerfulness that didn't reach his cold eyes, "I've brought Mr. Peterson from our legal department to help resolve our unfortunate situation." Without waiting for an invitation, both men approached the cabin, the lawyer extracting a thick envelope from his briefcase and extending it toward Tommy with clinical detachment. "These are legal documents filed with the county court yesterday," he explained in a voice devoid of emotion. "They outline the basic legal principle that minors cannot own real property without proper guardianship arrangements. The court has been asked to place this property into receivership pending resolution, which effectively means you cannot remain here unattended." Blackwell's smile widened fractionally as Tommy accepted the envelope with reluctant hands. "We've included a generous offer to purchase the cabin and land, which would provide funds for your care in a more appropriate setting," he added, his tone suggesting he was offering salvation rather than orchestrating theft. "It's really in everyone's best interest, especially yours." Tommy said nothing, clutching the papers while Max pressed reassuringly against his leg, the border collie's presence a reminder that he wasn't truly alone against these men in expensive shoes who wielded papers instead of weapons to claim what wasn't theirs. Martha arrived just as the corporate representatives were returning to their vehicle, her ancient pickup skidding slightly on the gravel as she braked with more force than necessary, her face flushed with indignation when Tommy showed her the legal documents. "Well, they've certainly played their hand," she muttered, scanning the dense legal language with narrowed eyes. "We need Harlan Jenkins, and quick." The following morning found Tommy and Martha in the cluttered office of Harlan Jenkins, a rumpled, white-haired lawyer whose family had practiced in Whisper Creek for 3 generations, his walls adorned with fading photographs of mountain landscapes rather than the imposing law books Tommy had expected. "Blackwell's attorneys are technically correct about minors and property ownership," Harlan explained, adjusting spectacles that seemed permanently smudged. But their petition has a fundamental flaw they couldn't possibly have anticipated. The elderly lawyer extracted a folder from a towering stack on his desk, blowing dust from its cover to reveal Eleanor Miller's name written in faded ink. "Your grandmother came to see me 2 years before her passing," he continued, eyes twinkling with the pleasure of someone about to spring a well-set trap. "She established what's called a generational land trust, specifically naming you as beneficiary, with Martha designated as trustee until you reach adulthood." He pushed a document across the desk, pointing to Eleanor's signature alongside the official notary seal. "She anticipated exactly this situation, told me that corporate vultures never stop circling what they want, and ensured the Miller property would remain in Miller hands regardless of age or circumstance." Martha's expression transformed from worry to triumphant relief as Harlan outlined their counterfiling, his gnarled fingers tapping the trust document with satisfaction. Eleanor was a formidable woman, planned for contingencies most people wouldn't even consider. She knew someday her grandson might need to stand where Joseph once stood, and made certain he'd have legal ground beneath his feet when that day came. That night, a powerful storm rolled across the mountain, thunder shaking the cabin's timbers as rain lashed against the windows like nature itself, sharing Tommy's growing anger at what had been done to this land and the people who called it home. Sleep claimed him amid the tempest, drawing him deeper than ever before into a dream so vivid he could feel the cabin floor beneath his feet, smell the pine smoke from a fire that burned in the hearth, though he had lit no such fire before sleeping. Joseph Miller stood before him, not as the young man from previous dreams, but as Tommy had seen him in the historical photograph. His face weathered by years of struggle, yet his eyes bright with the same determination Tommy sometimes glimpsed in his own reflection. "You found my journal, and now the key," Joseph said, his voice clear above the storm's fury, neither ghostly nor distant but as present as if they occupied the same moment in time. "You understand now why I could not let them destroy the evidence, why the truth had to survive even if I did not." The cabin walls seemed to dissolve around them, replaced by visions that flowed like water, scenes from the past made present through the strange alchemy of the dream. Tommy saw clear mountain streams running with an unnatural blue tinge, watched as a younger Joseph collected samples in glass jars, carefully labeling each with location and date. The vision shifted to a small medical clinic where worried parents held children with rashes blooming across their skin like cruel flowers, other children too weak to stand, their small faces pale with a sickness that local doctors could not name, but that Joseph had recognized as symptoms of metal poisoning carried in the water from the mine's new chemical processes. "They thought they silenced me," Joseph continued as the scenes changed to show confrontations between his great-grandfather and men in suits, threats delivered with corporate smiles, offers of money that would solve one family's problems, while dooming countless others to continued poisoning. But I knew someday another Miller would return to this mountain, someone with the same blood flowing through their veins, the same connection to this land that runs deeper than property deeds or legal claims. The dreamscape shifted once more, focusing on the iron box with its mysterious symbols. "The inscription means exactly what it says, Tommy. Blood must return to blood. The box will open only for a Miller. Contains a mechanism that responds to our family's touch alone, a safeguard against those who would destroy what's inside." Joseph knelt before him, their eyes level, the resemblance between them unmistakable across the generations that separated their lives. Inside that box is irrefutable proof of what Mountain Valley Resources did to our family, to dozens of families, to the land and water itself, scientific evidence collected over years that even today's courts cannot ignore. Lightning flashed, illuminating Joseph's face with an almost supernatural clarity. "They took everything from me, even my life, but they couldn't find the box. Now they'll try to take everything from you as well, because men like Blackwell and his masters never stop, never learn, never face consequences unless someone forces them to confront their crimes." The cabin began to solidify around them once more as the dream started to fade, Joseph's voice growing more urgent. "Trust Martha. Trust the townsfolk who stood for you. Most importantly, trust yourself, Tommy. You are 7 years old but carry the weight of justice 50 years delayed. The key will work only in your hands. The evidence speaks only through a Miller's courage. What was begun with my blood must be finished with yours." The circle closing at last, Tommy woke with a gasp as thunder cracked directly overhead, his heart pounding and tears streaming down his face. the profound connection to his great-grandfather lingering like a physical presence in the dark cabin while outside. The storm began to clear, stars emerging in the vast mountain sky like witnesses to a truth that could no longer remain buried. Dawn broke clear and cold after the storm, pale light filtering through the cabin windows as Tommy retrieved the iron box from its hiding place beneath the creekside rock, his hands trembling slightly as he placed it on the rough wooden table beside the brass key. The moment felt momentous, heavy with history and responsibility that seemed to press against his small shoulders as he carefully examined the intricate symbols etched into the metal surface. The keyhole was unlike any he'd seen before, surrounded by concentric rings of symbols that appeared capable of rotation, suggesting a combination rather than a simple lock. Tommy inserted the key, feeling it slide perfectly into place, yet nothing happened when he attempted to turn it, the mechanism unyielding despite the obvious match between key and lock. Frustration welled within him as he tried various positions, remembering Joseph's words from the dream about blood returning to blood, wondering if there was some literal interpretation involving actual blood that he hadn't understood. Max, who had been watching intently from beside the table, suddenly rose and approached the box, his nose twitching with interest before he raised his paw and deliberately pressed against one of the symbols, a crescent moon shape on the outermost ring. The symbol depressed slightly with an almost imperceptible click, causing Tommy to stare in astonishment as Max moved with deliberate precision to touch another symbol, then another. Following a pattern Tommy hadn't detected but that the border collie somehow sensed with his mysterious animal awareness. Following Max's lead, Tommy rotated the rings to align the activated symbols with markers on the box's surface, each correct placement producing another faint click until a sequence of 5 symbols formed a straight line from the edge to the keyhole. When he turned the key again, the mechanism finally yielded, gears moving within the ancient container as the lid began to rise slightly, revealing a glimpse of yellowed papers and what appeared to be glass vials carefully packed within. The sound of an approaching vehicle shattered the moment of discovery, tires crunching on the gravel outside with unmistakable purpose. Tommy's heart lurched with panic as he quickly closed the lid, the box resealing itself with a series of clicks, and barely managed to slide it beneath his sleeping bag before the cabin door burst open without warning or courtesy. Richard Blackwell entered first, flanked by 2 men Tommy hadn't seen before, their expressions grim and their eyes scanning the cabin interior with calculated efficiency. "Where is it, boy?" Blackwell demanded without preamble, his corporate polish abandoned in favor of naked intimidation as he advanced into the small space. "Our patience has run out, and so has your time for games." His gaze fell on the brass key Tommy hadn't managed to hide, still gleaming on the wooden table like a beacon. "So you found the key," Blackwell said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as one of his associates moved to block the cabin's only exit. "Now you'll tell us where Joseph Miller's evidence box is hidden, or I promise you'll regret your stubbornness far more than your great-grandfather ever had the chance to." The standoff in the cabin stretched like a taut wire, Blackwell's shadow falling across Tommy as the man took another menacing step forward. Max positioned himself protectively in front of the boy, hackles raised and a warning growl rumbling from deep in his chest. The sound of another vehicle approaching broke the tension momentarily, Blackwell's eyes flicking toward the window with annoyance that transformed to alarm as Martha's voice rang out, unnaturally loud and panicked. "Fire! The back of the cabin's caught fire." The declaration was followed by the crash of something heavy being thrown against the rear wall, the sound reverberating through the small structure. Blackwell's associates instinctively turned toward the commotion, their momentary distraction creating the opening Tommy had been silently praying for. With the reflexes of a child accustomed to quick movement, Tommy grabbed the iron box from beneath his sleeping bag, clutching it to his chest as he whistled sharply to Max, a signal they had practiced during their woodland explorations. The border collie responded instantly, charging toward the larger of the 2 men, and delivering a strategic nip to the back of his knee that sent him stumbling into his companion. Tommy darted through the narrow gap their collision created, hearing Blackwell's outraged shout behind him as he burst through the cabin door into the crisp mountain air where Martha stood with a knowing gleam in her eye, a smoking bundle of pine branches in her hand explaining the fire she had so convincingly announced. "Run, child," she commanded, using the smoldering branches to momentarily block Blackwell as he attempted to follow. "I'll be right behind you." Tommy needed no further encouragement, his small legs pumping as he sprinted toward the tree line with Max keeping perfect pace beside him, the weight of the iron box heavy in his arms but nothing compared to the burden of responsibility that drove him forward. Behind them, shouts and the sound of pursuit grew as Blackwell's men recovered from the confusion and gave chase, their longer adult strides eating up the distance despite Tommy's head start. The forest welcomed him like an old friend, familiar paths opening before him as Tommy instinctively turned away from the obvious trails, choosing instead the secret ways he had discovered during weeks of exploration with Max. He moved with the confident agility of a child who had made the mountain his playground, scrambling over fallen logs and ducking under low branches that his adult pursuers would need to navigate more carefully. Joseph's journal had described a hidden cave system on the mountain's eastern face, once used as shelter by miners during a violent strike in the 1930 seconds. Its entrance concealed behind a natural curtain of vines and brush that appeared impenetrable to casual observation. Tommy had discovered it purely by accident weeks earlier while following Max on what had seemed like a wild chase after a rabbit, the border collie somehow knowing exactly where to find the narrow opening that now represented their only hope of sanctuary. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as Tommy led Max through a nearly invisible game trail that skirted a steep ravine, the terrain growing increasingly challenging even for his small, nimble form. His lungs burned with the effort of running while carrying the heavy box, but fear and determination pushed him onward until finally, the distinctive cluster of 3 lightning-struck pines Joseph had described in his journal came into view, marking the approach to the hidden cave. The hidden cave opened like a sanctuary within the mountain's embrace, its cool interior stretching back into darkness, while the narrow entrance remained barely visible behind the curtain of vines and undergrowth that had protected its secret for decades. Tommy sank to his knees on the smooth stone floor, his small body trembling with exertion as Max kept vigilant watch at the concealed opening, ears pricked forward for any sound of approaching danger. The iron box sat before him in a shaft of light that penetrated through a small fissure in the cave ceiling, the symbols seeming to shift and dance in the dappled illumination, as Tommy carefully aligned the concentric rings in the sequence Max had somehow known, each click bringing him closer to the truth his great-grandfather had died protecting. The brass key turned smoothly this time, the mechanism yielding with a final decisive click that echoed in the cave's hushed interior as the lid rose to reveal its precious contents, meticulously preserved and organized with the careful attention of a man who knew these documents might represent his final testimony. Glass vials containing murky water samples were cushioned in fabric, each labeled with dates and locations corresponding to a detailed map showing the spread of contamination from the mining operation's northern shaft throughout the valley's groundwater system. Vivid blue lines tracking poison's path to wells, springs, and creeks where children swam and families drew their drinking water. Beneath these lay folders of medical records Joseph had somehow obtained, documenting a tragic pattern of unusual cancers, birth defects, and blood disorders clustered around exposure areas, their incidence increasing dramatically after Mountain Valley Resources introduced their new chemical extraction process in 1970. Most damning were internal company memos Joseph had acquired, perhaps from sympathetic employees, revealing executives' knowledge of the contamination and their calculated decision to suppress the information, with one document bearing Richard Blackwell Sr.'s signature explicitly rejecting safety improvements as prohibitively expensive compared to potential settlement costs for affected families. Photographs documented dead wildlife along creek beds, children with mysterious rashes, and clandestine midnight dumping operations, each image more disturbing than the last as the comprehensive scope of the company's callous disregard for human life became undeniable. Tommy's hands trembled as he found a separate folder containing medical records for his own family, discovering with a wave of grief and rage that his grandmother's heart condition had been linked to chemical exposure, while a notation about his father's rare blood disorder carried the doctor's scribbled comment. Another case from Whisper Creek Valley, consistent with heavy metal poisoning profile. A final document lay beneath everything else, sealed in a separate waterproof pouch. A formal affidavit signed by Joseph Miller and witnessed by a state environmental investigator the very day before his disappearance, summarizing the evidence and formally charging Mountain Valley Resources with criminal negligence, deliberate contamination of public waterways, and the resulting manslaughter of at least 17 identified victims whose deaths could be directly attributed to the company's actions. A devastating legal indictment that never reached the authorities because Joseph himself had vanished before he could present it. Tommy had just carefully returned the documents to the box when Max suddenly stiffened, a low warning growl emanating from deep in the border collie's throat as he faced the cave entrance. Seconds later, the curtain of vines parted and Richard Blackwell stepped into the dimly lit space, his expensive suit now torn and dirty, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the pursuit through the forest. His cold eyes fixed immediately on the iron box, a triumphant smile spreading across his face as he blocked the only exit. "Quite the family tradition, isn't it?" Blackwell remarked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "A Miller boy hiding in the mountains with evidence that should have been destroyed decades ago." Tommy clutched the box tighter, a sudden realization dawning as he studied the man's features in the cave's filtered light. "You're not just a company representative," he said, his young voice steadier than he felt. "You're his grandson. The original Blackwell who threatened my great-grandfather." Something flickered in Blackwell's eyes, a grudging acknowledgement of the connection that spanned generations. Richard Blackwell Sr. built Mountain Valley Resources from nothing, and I won't let a child destroy what 3 generations have built. He took a step forward, hand extended. "That box has caused enough trouble for both our families. Give it to me now, and this all ends today." Tommy backed away until the cave wall pressed against his spine, the weight of history heavy in his hands as he clutched his great-grandfather's legacy. "It only ends when the truth comes out," he replied, summoning courage from somewhere deep within, from the same well of determination that had sustained Joseph Miller half a century earlier. "People got sick, people died. Your family knew and did nothing to stop it." Blackwell's face hardened, the corporate mask slipping away completely. "Last chance, boy. That box? Now." He lunged forward suddenly, hands outstretched to grab the evidence, but Max intercepted him with startling speed, teeth bared as the border collie placed himself directly between Tommy and danger. Blackwell faltered, momentarily taken aback by the dog's fierce protectiveness, calculating his next move when a new voice echoed from the cave entrance. "That's quite far enough, Richard." Martha stood silhouetted in the opening, and beside her the tall, uniformed figure of Sheriff Collins, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered weapon. "Tommy, you all right in there?" the sheriff called, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the standoff. "Mrs. Whitaker here has been telling me quite a story on our drive up the mountain." Blackwell straightened, smoothing his ruined suit jacket in a futile attempt to regain composure. "Sheriff, this is a simple trespassing matter. The boy has stolen company property, and I'm simply retrieving it." Sheriff Collins stepped fully into the cave, his presence filling the space with calm authority. "Funny, that's not what the property records show. And that box?" He nodded toward the container in Tommy's hands. "Mrs. Whitaker says it contains evidence of crimes that have gone unpunished for far too long. I think we'll all take a trip to my office and sort this out properly." The Whisper Creek Chronicle ran its first special edition in 30 years, the bold headline proclaiming, "Miller Vindicated." Decades of corporate poisoning exposed, above a photograph of Tommy standing solemnly beside Sheriff Collins as the iron box was officially entered into evidence. Within days, the small mountain town found itself transformed by the arrival of news vans from national networks. Satellite dishes blooming like strange mechanical flowers in the community center parking lot, as reporters with polished voices and concerned expressions conducted interviews against the backdrop of the mountains that had silently witnessed the tragedy unfolding beneath their slopes. State environmental officials arrived with testing equipment, their preliminary findings confirming what Joseph Miller had documented 50 years earlier. The contamination not only still present but having spread further through the aquifer despite the company's repeated assurances of safety and compliance. Most damning were the internal memos proving 3 generations of Blackwell leadership had actively concealed test results while implementing cost-saving measures that prioritized profit over human life. Their calculated risk assessment, coldly weighing potential lawsuit settlements against the expense of proper containment and cleanup. The town hall overflowed during the public forum, elderly residents rising one after another to share stories of inexplicable illnesses that had claimed loved ones, children born with defects, livestock that wasted away despite veterinary intervention, all occurring in patterns that precisely matched the contamination map Joseph Miller had so carefully created. Betty Thornton, now stooped with age, tearfully described losing 3 children to the same rare blood disorder within a 5-year period. The doctors baffled, while Mountain Valley Resources representatives attended each funeral with practiced sympathy and discreet suggestions about other potential causes. Frank Westley, who had worked in the mine for 26 years, pulled up his sleeve to reveal skin mottled with unusual scarring he attributed to handling equipment that came into contact with the contaminated water, showing photographs of a dozen colleagues with similar markings, most now deceased from cancers that seemed to cluster among those who worked the northern shaft. The school gymnasium became an impromptu medical screening center as specialists from the state university arrived to document health patterns, the line stretching around the block as residents came forward with medical records and family histories that painted a devastating portrait of generational suffering. Richard Blackwell himself had been taken into custody, his arrest broadcast live on the evening news as he was led from the corporate headquarters in handcuffs, the charges including criminal negligence, environmental violations, and obstruction of justice spanning decades of deliberate deception. James Blackwell stopped attending school, his family's name now synonymous with the tragedy that had befallen Whisper Creek, while several company executives had already turned state's evidence, offering testimony in exchange for leniency as the corporate hierarchy began to crumble under the weight of exposed truth. As national attention intensified, more communities downstream began conducting their own tests, discovering traces of the same industrial compounds in their water supplies, widening the scope of the disaster beyond even what Joseph Miller had documented. The state attorney general announced a criminal investigation into both the original contamination and the subsequent cover-up, while federal agencies mobilized resources for what experts were already calling one of the most significant environmental crimes ever concealed from the public. Through it all, Tommy moved quietly at Martha's side, his small face solemn as he watched justice finally taking shape for a community that had suffered in silence for generations, understanding with growing clarity that the box hadn't just contained evidence of past wrongdoing but had preserved the voice of his great-grandfather, allowing Joseph Miller to finally testify through the hands of his 7-year-old descendant, who had completed the circle of truth he had begun half a century earlier. Winter yielded to spring as the wheels of justice began their slow but inexorable turn. Grand jury indictments coming down against 15 current and former Mountain Valley Resources executives, including Richard Blackwell, who remained in custody after being denied bail as a flight risk, his carefully constructed world of corporate power collapsing beneath the weight of evidence preserved by a man whose voice he had tried to silence half a century earlier. The class action lawsuit filed on behalf of affected families drew over 300 participants, spanning 3 generations of Whisper Creek residents, their combined testimony creating a tapestry of suffering that moved even the most stoic court officials to visible emotion during preliminary hearings. Federal environmental officials established a permanent monitoring station on the mountain, the cleanup operation projected to span decades with an estimated cost of over $400 million. Funds that would be drawn directly from Mountain Valley Resources assets, following the judge's unprecedented freezing of corporate accounts to ensure accountability. The small mountain community that had been fractured by the town hall meeting now found itself uniting around a shared purpose of healing and restoration. Neighbors who had stood on opposite sides of the debate, coming together to establish a memorial garden where the names of those lost to the contamination could be preserved and honored. The first name engraved in the central stone monument being Joseph Miller, no longer remembered as a troublemaker but recognized as the first to stand against a tide of corporate greed that had nearly drowned the truth. Tommy found himself unexpectedly in the spotlight as his story captured national attention. The image of a 7-year-old orphan bringing down a corporate giant through courage and determination, resonating deeply in a country hungry for heroes who embodied the ideal that one person, no matter how small or seemingly powerless, could still change the course of history through unwavering commitment to truth. The governor herself visited Whisper Creek to present Tommy with a special citation for civic courage, kneeling to pin the medal on his small chest as cameras flashed and Martha stood nearby, her weathered face streaming with tears of pride and vindication for the Miller family legacy she had helped preserve. Most meaningful for Tommy was the creation of the Joseph Miller Environmental Health Fund, established using the first settlement monies from Mountain Valley Resources, dedicated to providing medical care for affected families and funding research into treatments for the specific conditions caused by the industrial contamination. A living legacy that would continue his great-grandfather's work of protecting the community he had loved enough to die for. The cabin itself became a symbol of resilience, volunteers from throughout the region arriving on weekends to repair its aging structure, replacing the sagging roof and broken windows, reinforcing the foundation and restoring the stone fireplace where the iron box had waited so patiently for the return of Miller blood. The building transformed from a neglected relic into a proud testament to one family's refusal to surrender truth to power. Spring brought new growth to the mountain slopes, wildflowers pushing through soil that would take generations to fully heal, their persistence mirroring the community's determination to reclaim what had been damaged but not destroyed. Tommy often sat on the cabin's rebuilt porch with Max beside him, watching the environmental teams working methodically across the landscape, their presence a promise that, though justice had arrived late, it had arrived nonetheless, and that the invisible suffering of countless families had finally been acknowledged, their pain given voice, their losses recognized, and their future reclaimed from the shadow of corporate greed that had for too long darkened the beautiful mountain valley that Joseph Miller had given his life to protect. Autumn returned to Whisper Creek Mountain in a blaze of gold and crimson, marking a full year since a small boy with $5 had purchased a haunted cabin and changed the course of history. The cabin stood transformed, its weathered logs carefully restored, its windows gleaming in the October sunlight as a small crowd gathered for the official dedication of the Joseph Miller Historical Site. The property now permanently protected by state landmark status that would ensure its preservation for generations to come. Tommy stood on the porch steps, no longer the lost orphan, but a child with purpose, his blue eyes clear and confident as he cut the ceremonial ribbon stretched across the doorway of what had become both home and museum. The cabin's front room, restored with meticulous attention to historical detail, now housed glass display cases containing Joseph's journal, photographs, and carefully preserved water samples, the iron box itself holding the place of honor on the original desk where Tommy had discovered the key. Its contents now digitized and part of court records, but the container itself, a powerful symbol of one man's determination to protect truth at any cost. Beyond the museum space, connected by a short hallway, stood the private living quarters that Tommy shared with Martha, whose petition for legal guardianship had been granted with enthusiastic support from social services once the extraordinary circumstances of their connection had been established. The elderly woman finding renewed purpose in raising the last Miller child, while Tommy found in her the family connection he had lost and desperately needed. Max still patrolled the property with vigilant dedication, though his protective instincts had mellowed now that the immediate threat had passed. The border collie content to rest in the dappled shade of the porch while visitors arrived to learn about the environmental tragedy and subsequent justice that had unfolded on this quiet mountain. Educational tours now regularly brought school children from throughout the state to hear Tommy himself explain how the corporate poisoning had been exposed, his own peers watching with wide-eyed amazement as their classmate recounted finding the mysterious box that changed everything. The 7-year-old having matured beyond his years, through experiences that had connected him deeply to a great-grandfather he had never met, but whose courage now flowed through his own actions. The mountain itself seemed to breathe easier as remediation efforts continued, test wells showing gradual improvement in groundwater quality, while new vegetation reclaimed areas that had long been barren, the land slowly healing alongside the community that called it home. Monthly town gatherings now took place on the property, neighbors who had once been divided finding common ground in their shared history and commitment to ensuring such corporate exploitation could never again take root in their valley, their children playing freely in meadows that were being systematically restored to their natural state. On quiet evenings, after visitors had departed and the museum door was locked, Tommy often sat with Martha on the rebuilt porch, sharing simple meals and stories that wove together their separate histories into a shared narrative of loss, perseverance, and ultimately, triumph. The trust established in his grandmother's name had ensured not only Tommy's legal right to the property but his financial security, allowing him to focus on school and the ongoing educational work that had become his passion despite his young age. What had begun with $5 and a desperate need for shelter had transformed into something neither Tommy nor Joseph could have fully imagined, a legacy fulfilled, a family forged through shared purpose rather than blood alone, and a community reclaiming its voice after decades of silence, all because a small boy and his loyal dog had dared to uncover a secret that no one else had been brave enough to open.